A few years back, when I first started playing around with satellite images, I applied for an internship. Part of the interviewing was to do some basic processing on an image and then display the result. I didn't really know much about satellite images back then, and I do recall the interviewer nudging me to open the image in this thing called QGIS. So I went and I downloaded this piece of software I'd never heard about before, and I remember being pretty overwhelmed by what I had just opened up. And I couldn't really figure out how to quickly load a satellite image in there. I later realized it really wasn't that complicated, but still, it wasn't intuitive nor straightforward. Since then, I've grown to love and embrace all the tools that we have today to manipulate maps. But still, somewhere in the back of my mind, I remember that experience. So when I first heard about Felt, I got pretty excited. Today's guest is John Duruk, one of their co-founders, and this is how he puts it.
Felt is an internet-based mapping tool that makes maps fun to collaborate on.
In the conversation, we'll talk about building modern mapping platforms on the browser, why now is the time they're doing it, and what such a tool could open up. After our conversation, John actually shared all the links to the topics we discussed on a map. If nothing else, that was kind of fun. Needless to say, this is a fun conversation about what the future of collaborative mapping could look like. I hope you'll enjoy it. Before that, this episode is sponsored by the Satellite-Image-Deep-Learning newsletter. This newsletter, written by Robin Cole, aggregates some of the latest deep learning research, new datasets, or competition applied to satellite imagery. When I'm not running this podcast, I work as a data scientist in the field of Earth observation, and I'm pretty much always trying to keep up and find new ways to just know about the latest research going on, but there's a lot to keep up with. So more and more, I'm turning myself towards aggregators, people who do keep up better than I do, and then put all their findings together. I can't recommend Robin's newsletter enough to keep up with deep learning applied to satellite imagery. I'll have a link below for you to see some of the previous issues and sign up to the newsletter. I don't know if you're aware, I actually start these conversations with the same question every single time. I like asking people how they would describe themselves. I'm quite curious, how would you describe yourself?
I mean, I think depends on who's asking. The context is important. You know, if you're like in a business conversation, personal conversation, obviously I'm the same person, but I would describe myself as John. And I would then go into, but it's a Turkish name. So you might see spelled as C-A-N. So that's sort of my way of like hazing, you know, like people have to like understand how my name works. Probably describe myself as someone who is humorous, maybe teetering on the edge of a bit too cynical, funny, self-proclaimed. And probably if it's a business conversation, I would also say, you know, I run a small tech company called Felt. We make maps and we make them fun.
Let's go on Felt then. Same question, can you actually, how do you describe what Felt is?
Felt is an internet-based mapping tool that makes maps fun to collaborate on, simple and powerful. That's sort of the short version for Felt. Sometimes people compare it to Figma for maps, Google Docs for maps. I think there's a lot of truth in those comparisons. But the goal of Felt is to essentially make map making kind of fun and powerful, like a lot of browser-based tools turned all those desktop class software into like something more fun and collaborative.
You've used the word fun multiple times. Can you expand on that? What makes it fun and why is that important?
What makes it fun and why is it important? There are like two questions there. I think let's start with like, why is it important? I think these tools, people spend hours and hours on like of their like days on these like mapping tools. You know, you talk to consultants, you know, they spend hours and hours in PowerPoint or Excel. Analysts use Excel. When you work with like mapping folks, they spend hours and hours on these tools. And if you can actually make it fun, it's more fun for us to build these tools. You know, we're also human. And the second is, I think if you make these tools fun, people go back to it. There's this, I think, almost intangible quality to certain tools where there's like millions of small interactions, like whether the UI is this color or things like animate this way, or they pick this font, or where they've picked this kind of copy, that makes it more fun. The ironic fun is this quality where you go back, be like, you smile, but like you can tell the tool is on your side. And I think that's the sort of like quality that we're trying to espouse. And then the reason why it's important is like it's also part of like business thing. We want people to sort of feel good after using felt versus feel tired. There are definitely certain tools that I think like Notion is a good example. There's like certain things in Notion that you can tell like this was made by people that are fun to hang out with, and then it just makes you feel happy to click around. And there's like certain tools, you know, I'm not gonna name any I'm not gonna badmouth any tools, but there's certain tools you use them, be like, oh man, this was an arduous process, and then you probably end up with the same results. You probably end up with the same artifacts, but you want to go back to the first one. You know, Slack is another great example. I think early on, no one could tell you why Slack was more fun than IRC or other chat tools, but it was fun. And then like it just got adopted slowly but steadily, and then became like the behemoth that we all know now.
How do you build fun? It feels like I understand what you're talking about, like that experience, but then it's like engineering something that feels like that. How do you tackle that problem?
I think I would credit more to our like product team. I think you just have to have this like taste for fun. I think if you want like something like systematic, you just need to be sort of have a personality in your tool. Like you need to sort of have like a stance and like be consistent with it. I think that's what we do systematically correct. You know, we just have this like, okay, like this is sort of like how we talk to our users. This is how like UI sort of like feels. This is how it should leave you with this kind of feeling. And then we are somewhat like fearless in like, no, like, you know, in our upload anything tool when we built it, right? The idea was that, you know, you drag in any file, it just kind of works. It is this like insanely powerful tool that probably nothing, you know, works like it does right now. But if you look at our first sort of how we were like marketing it, our designer, Lauren, he has his dog, Daisy. He loves his dog. Like we've seen him multiple times, the dog. In the UI, he was just like making this like, you know, like small like illustration, and he put like Daisy just like with his tongue out. And we're like, let's keep it. Like a lot of people make maps with geospatial data, CSVs, geo packages, but there's also like a picture of like Daisy and like as part of the thing that is like upload anything, right? Because anything is anything. Like anything is not just like geo package and, you know, Esri like ARC shape files or, you know, like Excel. Like anything is also pictures of Daisy that are like geotagged, or maybe not. That's also fine. You know, so you kind of like have this like, yes, we work with CSVs. Yes, we will probably understand file formats that have like no one else does, but like we will also like happily take in like pictures of Daisy and work with them. So I think that's what I'm talking about, like fearlessness, this like stance. And I think that has served us well.
Right. So yeah, it's like breaking down what people might actually care about. Like the CSV is just a tool that people will use, but what they care about is also the picture of their dog. Like, because they care about their dog, and that might not fit in a CSV. Yeah,
I mean, we're making tools for people, you know, at the end of the day.
Yeah, I like that, having personality. Like, I think in the software world that gets referred to as being opinionated is like making a decision and like, this is how it is, and not something like that. I want to get back to the upload anything as well. Like the first before that is, why do maps need to be fun? And like, why maps? Why tackle that problem specifically? Like if we go back out a little bit.
I mean, I think there's two sort of threads that go into it. One is both Sam and I, my co-founder Sam Hashimi, work with Mappy related software, right? I was at Uber for 3 years or so. Obviously, Uber works a lot with maps. We had a lot of internal mapping tools. You kind of like get this feeling that like a lot of the tools Uber internally build were like, this is like stuff that would be useful for other people too. Like, why is just Uber that have to make this map? On the other side, you know, like Sam's previous company, Remix, was all about maps in a similar sense. They kind of built transit planning software and then sort of became the de facto transit planning software. I don't know if where you live also uses it, but my hunch is yes. It's like they had like 400 customers, 17, 18 countries. So we kind of like work with like maps a lot. And then you kind of like, you know, both of us knew a lot about maps. And I get this like feeling that this is like an underserved market in the sense that, you know, like Excel has moved to the web, you know, PowerPoint stuff has moved to the web, video is moving to the web, everything is moving to the web. And then if you look at maps, it is still sort of like desktop is where you start making a map, unless you have access to these, you know, unless you can hire people that can build you just like one-off maps using, you know, like leaflets or like Mapbox.gl and get data from this place and then get this data from other place. And like someone has to build a UI on top of it that way. And it just seems sort of like wrong. Like it's almost like philosophically, like someone has forgotten that maps are a tool that millions of people use every day. It's a tool. Like it is not some like fun thing to look at. Obviously it is, but it is like a tool that millions of people use to get their jobs done. And authoring a map is just, you start on the desktop and God forbid you had to collaborate. Like you were, as they say, SOL, you know, sorely out of luck. You know, I don't want to like swear on your podcast, but
you can go ahead. That's fine.
Yeah, you know, people call the shit out of like SOL. But and then, yeah, if you have to collaborate, you had to go back to kind of like flattening the map, right? You had to take a screenshot, and then at that moment you kind of lose all the fidelity. What kind of data is there? How do you like collect comments from your, you know, stakeholders? It was just like a mess. So we're like, okay, like. And I think there's a part of like, it doesn't have to be this hard. Like, honestly, this is just, you just need to sort of like understand what pieces to connect to each other. And then like Felt kind of like built itself. Obviously, I'm like grossly simplifying things, but I think there was the idea that like it was sort of wildly powerful thing that millions of people use, millions of people do to get their jobs done. And then millions of people struggle collaborating on. And we're like, okay, like web sort of solves a lot of those problems. You know, you don't have to install anything. You don't have to like just like open up a page, click some buttons, or move your mouse around. So like creation becomes easy. Collaboration becomes easy because you just like send someone like a link. Yeah, so that's like the short answer is that we sort of like saw that it was under invested in. I think a lot of people were like overserved in some ways. Like the tools that they were using, the desktop class software is just like way too powerful for a lot of what people need. So they're like, okay, there's a gap there. So we attacked that.
Did you have like a specific use case in mind where like sometimes in these origin stories, there's like specifically something that was like, aha, this is the moment. This is the thing where it feels like it could help. You mentioned you worked at Uber and there's a lot of mapping there. Is there like something specific?
The specific sort of the origin story was mostly around incident response and firefighting.
Okay.
That was sort of like, if you harken back to the Felt's first website and like our first seed deck, Sam and I both live in the Bay Area in San Francisco. Like I live in San Francisco, Sam lives in Oakland. We have an office in Oakland. Going back to 2020, there was these wildfires in the Bay Area, which happen every year. But like in 2020, they happened like for so long. I don't know if you remember, people were like sharing these like orange skies, like sky turned orange. It was like wild. So that's like when we were like thinking about starting a company. And then we constantly, everyone was like looking at maps. So, you know, there's like wildfires, the air quality in the Bay Area is so bad. They're like, stay indoors. But there's also COVID, but like stay indoors, but like not too indoors. Like stay indoors, but by yourself, and make sure you have a blah, blah, blah. So that is the incident response was the first, like, okay, like this is clearly a need. When you like look at the maps, the Cal Fire, like California Department of Fire, all these things, it's just like these people are struggling to make and use maps. What if there was a better tool? So that's the incident response was the first sort of business, and kind of like move from there, obviously.
Have you worked with them since, like with firefighters?
We have currently we're not like currently working with like firefighters exactly. So let me kind of like harken back, and we gotta go back a bit. Right now, we are building this tool that is free to use for everyone. But we've officially told people starting in 2024, go to like our website, it's all there. I'm not kind of like leaking anything. Not that there's much to leak. We're basically told people starting in 2024, if you use Felt with your team, certain features will be paid. We're still in the process of like figuring out like what that pricing model looks like, how much we're going to charge people or going to charge people by. It is imperative for us to have a free tier. There is going to be a free tier. You will be able to make some apps in some fashion or format on the free tier. I think that's key, and we want to maintain that. Since then, we've been working a lot with urban planning folks, urban consultancies. We started working a lot with satellite companies. I know that's like something that you work a lot with. So the incident response is like, if you go to like Felt and go to use cases, like it's like high up there. Incident response requires a bit of sort of like special treatment.
In what way?
I think there's a lot of questions. There's like certain product features that we probably need to like rejigger / build / think about. I don't want to like tip my hat, but
sure,
probably by the time this podcast is out, some of them will be launched. So there's a lot of how do people like comment on a map? How do people actually gather feedback? How do you sort of like share links and get input from other folks? Like that stuff is like not there yet, but watch the space,
right?
As they say.
Yeah. Cool. That's so there's a bunch of things I want to come back to. As I'm thinking about this, I'm like, okay, this makes sense. If we're thinking about Slack or Google Docs, like on the growth side, like there's a free tier, but then there's Slack. I think is maybe a better example because Google can afford to have like Google Docs be free. Like it's just such a huge giant thing. Slack is maybe a bit different, where they have to have Slack work. So yeah, that makes sense on like, you got to make money somehow, but I'm guessing like the free model is allowing people to give it a shot and try it around, play it around, and then pay if they want more with it. I want to talk about the comments and like the usability. As you're talking about that, I'm thinking back to Google Docs, back to Slack. A lot of it is one-dimensional. It's like, this message happened and then this message happened, or I wrote this line and then this line happened, and like it's very up or down in time. And Google Docs is also the same, and you can comment. A map now is like in 2-dimension, like you have a whole other problem. So how are you tackling all of that? Like what's the philosophy behind making that process interactable or collaborative? I don't know if you think about it in the same ways of dimensions, but that's the first thing that comes to mind.
I guess I'm still trying to sort of like pluck out what do you mean by dimensions. It's like different. Like you talk about like dimensions like linear, like time.
Yeah, it's just like if you
time
go
goes
through
one way in every dimension, man. And
yeah, fair enough. No, I mean like you read a docs, from top to bottom. You like
I see.
A Slack thread is from top to bottom.
I see. That's one of the like fun / interesting parts of maps is that, yeah, it's not this like linear top to bottom formats on like maps. So it's like, yeah, I guess it is still 2-dimensional, but like, yeah, there's like one direction. Like maps, you can go up, down, left, right. You can zoom in, zoom out. It's actually like more than that, right? Like in like a Google, like you imagine you're looking at a Google Doc, you can go top to bottom. On a map, you can go up, right, and up, down, left, right, or north, south, east, west. But you could also like zoom in and zoom out, and like they're entirely wildly different. Looking into streets of like Antwerp is wildly different than like looking at Belgium, and wildly different than looking at Europe, and like wildly different than looking at the world. So like you had to sort of like your tool has to work on all dimensions. Yeah, it is definitely like a design challenge. I think there's a lot of like product thinking that goes into it. We have sort of like a couple, I wouldn't call like tricks. I think we just try to do the right thing, which is that, our tools, our technology is smart enough that we kind of like know the bounding box of where the interaction happens. So like we can kind of know when the interaction is it happening at the street level? Is it happening at like, city level, like province level, state level, country level? So like when you share a link, Felt will do the right thing and like take you to the right place automatically. And then, and it requires a lot of sort of like iteration. And then like, okay, like there are certain things that are like not easy to solve. And I don't know if we have the answers yet, like, because I don't think anyone really has. This is like a lot of like, I think like, like an untrodden ground. It's like, what if there's some interaction that happened at like, street level and also at state level and also at country level? Like, how does the UI handle it? We'll see. Like the other side is like, are those like real issues, or is it sort of like philosophical issues? That's the other thing. I think Sam has a pretty strong sense of like solve problems people are experiencing, not solve problems you think people will experience. Because people will surprise you in ways. Like people do surprise you in how they run into problems you would have never thought.
Do you have examples? Like anything come to mind that you can talk about?
Sure. I mean, there's like millions of like file formats under the sun that we can support, right? And then like there's this like, oh, we should support this, we should support this, we should support this. And then some person upload. Well, I mean, like I'll talk about one thing. I once like uploaded this like 100 megabyte raster imagery. So we kind of been like working like raster imagery support, right? Somewhat sizable, but like, like our upload tool like supports all the way up to like 5 gigs, and then we can actually like support a bit more. It's sort of like Amazon limit, but so you can kind of like drag in any side of the file. We kind of like bloop, 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 do the right thing. And then we've been like trying it out with like gigabytes and gigabytes of files, right? So like 100 megabytes is sort of like at this point, it's like, come on, like I wouldn't even break a sweat. It's like 100 megabytes. And like I uploaded this file, and then lo and behold, somehow along the line, it like exploded into like gigabytes and gigabytes because of the way we were like doing like some like over zooming stuff, and then like wreaked havoc. And then there was really like nothing really that special about that file either. Like there was this like a confluence of factors resulted in this like 100 megabyte file ballooning into like gigs and gigs of file. I think there's like millions of these cases where people will upload files, people will, because like this is, I think this goes back to like what I was saying earlier, like because it's like such an underserved market, people will try to upload what they thought should work. Like people upload like HTML contain like leaflets stuff. Okay, like is that something we can realistically handle? Like probably not, but like we try to like tell the users the right thing. I think one of the interesting things is that like the more we build features, the more people will also like break them, and then you have to sort of like decide like where the line is.
Is that like people just trying to push the boundary to test, or is it more like people not like you're reaching an audience that doesn't necessarily understand those things as much?
I mean, I think people should be free to do anything. Like I'm not,
right.
Like I don't want to blame anyone for like breaking felt. That's my job to fix. It's more that like the more you push to, I think people adjust very fast to like what they think the limits is, and then like hypothetical products, you have this like 100 megabyte upload limits, I don't know, like 100 row of limits, and then like people start getting used to that, and then at some point people forget that that's a limit, and then like they start like, well, like why does it not work with like 110? But like getting to 100 was already like a giant technical achievement for us maybe, getting the 100 millisecond achievement, and people are like, well, why is it not working with like 200? I'm like, I don't know why. Like, this is sort of like human nature, right? Like, why do we always want better things? Like, I don't know. Like, that's it, kind of both good and bad in some ways. Like, we're just this, like, we're never satisfied. Like, human nature is not satisfied. The moment we're satisfied, the moment like we admire and celebrate some achievement for like a hot minute, and then like the next day we're like, this is like boring. And then like, I don't know, like, look, like this like wireless mouse, the fact that any of this technology works is incredible, right? Like the math that goes into this, like, it's like mind blowing that anything works, and then we take it for granted, and that's okay. Like, that's my, like, I take it for granted as a person, and I want more. Like, why is my Bluetooth so slow? And like, how does it even actually work? It's like mind blowing, right? But at the same time, like, why is it slow? Like, why is it slow? Why is it not faster? So I think that's the other side. You know, people will break things. People do break our product every day. And then we fix it. And then they're going to break some other way tomorrow, and I will fix that too. I think like now we're at a place where we've kind of built enough bones and like systems around like systematically attacking things. We call that, for example, one of our sort of like initiatives, like code names. Not really a code name. It's literally called unlock more files. So we literally look at like what are some things that people upload that don't work, and then we kind of like go in and then like, okay, fix them. Like, is that something we can't fix realistically? Like different encodings, like of course we should fix it. You know, like people zip. A common thing is like people will zip things in confusing and creative ways. But like as a human, the moment you look at it, you realize, yeah, like, okay, like I understand what they did. And then like, okay, we should fix it. Like, we could tell them to like not do it. But at the same time, like most likely if someone does it, there's another person does it too. So
is that like one of the biggest challenges is actually parsing what people put in? Like, that's what I'm curious, like on the technical side, it's like, what are some of the biggest problems that you face? I'm just asking because we've talked a lot about that. Like, that's probably the first thing a lot of users do.
I think there's like different dimensions to this, you know, and I mean, this just goes back to like what I was saying, you know, like 5 gigs. It's like a lot, but it's also like not that much. You know, if you look at like how, you know, how certain, especially like the raster side, like I think, for example, there was like an inflection point for us. So now we can like work with like a lot of like raster data. And like obviously raster data is generally like a bit chunkier. So like 5 gigs is actually not that much in terms of raster. So, okay, like there's questions about like what do we do when like someone has like hundreds and hundreds of gigs and terabytes? But
it also could be a mistake. It could be like you dragged the wrong file. Like, how do you handle that? Because you could say, okay, sure, we're going to start uploading a terabyte. But it's like, maybe that's actually not what...
I think mistakes should be like blameless in the sense that like I don't want to like say anyone like you did the wrong thing. I think mistakes should be easy to recover from. That's like how you solve a lot of mistakes, right? Like if you try to like I mean, there's like technical limitations, obviously, right? Like the 5 gig limit sort of like comes from how much we can directly upload from the browser to S3 using like a signed post request, right? But we could probably find a way to handle like if someone drags in like a terabyte, the browser will be like WTF. So I mean, we know from the browser side, the size is the thing they're like trying to like upload, and like we know on the newer browsers what sort of like are they dragging a directory, are they dragging like a file, are they dragging like certain formats? So there's some control that we can do. I think the more interesting question is that like if there's a workflow these companies are using that requires them to like process terabytes stuff, like how does Felt kind of like slide into that workflow? Because we're like a browser-based tool, but at the same time, you know, there's like a lot of machinery working in the cloud and the pipelines, all that kind of stuff. So like, how do we sort of like expose that to those folks and then still get them to experience all the fun stuff Felt offers on the browser?
Yeah, that's actually a good place to go. Like a lot of the like big companies that use ArcGIS, for example, like have a big GIS department or something like that use maps, that create a lot of maps. A lot of the times they have things that just work, and like it can feel daunting to have something else that doesn't necessarily plug into that. And I feel like the offering that felt is like, oh, it's all on the browser. It's like taking a completely different turn from this is a desktop software thing. Have you found like that to be a problem where people are like, that's great, but it just like doesn't work with what I already have, like all these legacy stuff, which is why Excel, for example, is still around, is it just works with a lot of stuff.
Mm-hmm. I think workflows move to different places over time. So obviously I think a lot of the user interaction happens in the browser, but I think most people sort of like realize that there's some server somewhere that like, churns through their files. So like when you upload some JSON or ArcGIS file or shape file or geo package, whatever, there's a server somewhere processing them. Browser is just like an interface or what that pipeline, and we call it, it's really called the pipeline. Pipeline sort of like builds artifacts, tiles, and then the browser sort of like exposes them to the user, right? So I think most people, when we talk to them, they realize, okay, like how do we sort of like expose the pipeline to you, and then vice versa. So there's a lot of conversations that we're having with all those folks. In terms of your question about comment about like Excel, I like to tell the story of like, at Uber, this is 2015 or 16, people started like using Figma. And, like 2016, Figma was just not this like household name it is now. It's crazy, just like 7 years ago. And then there was this sort of like, so previously Uber was primarily using Sketch, this, wireframing / design tool. And it's a great tool. It's a desktop software. And like, I think like Sketch sort of like blew everyone's mind away, and then like, grabbed a lot of market share in like, the techie, the webby Bay Area scene. I think it's like a mindset, not a location. But and then when Figma, but like the problem with Sketch at a company like Uber was you have this like Sketch files spread around, like, okay, is the latest version of this design? Is it in like email? Is it in someone's Slack message? Is it in like our bug tracker? Is it in like Wiki? Is it in someone's, I don't know, USB flash drive? So Figma came along and it's like, okay, the latest version is always at this like URL. And then there was a bit of like concern because people were like, what is Figma? Like, why are we putting our company's latest designs on some random person's server? Like, is that safe? Like, what if that server gets hacked? But you cannot resist the gravity of a much better workflow. Like, I don't want to like name names, but like there was this like people are like, we're not like Figma is not a endorsed tool by the security team, and people are like, well, like, do you want me to get my job done, or do you want to like check boxes? And then you cannot resist the gravity of like people are trying to get their jobs done. So I think that's like, yeah, like I think Excel is still hugely powerful, but I think I wouldn't mistake, like, it's just, I would just be careful for like Excel forward. It's like, yeah, like your workflow is moving to the web, and like Microsoft knows about this, like everyone, like people are building stuff with like web firsts. I think at this point.
So it's like really about building the best tool for the job.
Yeah. I think, there's a bit of like push and pull. I think there's this, it's not just like if you build it, they will come. Like we are trying to build the most easy to collaborate tool, but at the same time, we have to tell people this exists, and we have to tell people, hey, if you actually use this tool, you will adopt the workflow, and yeah, there might be like initially like pains or concerns, or you might be a bit scared, but at the same time, once you adopt this, your workflow will get better. Your team will be more productive. Your team will be happier. So that's why we're kind of like building like a web-based tool. And then we have to train people. We have to teach people. We have to tell them our message that like this is a collaborative web-based tool that has some collaboration functionality current desktop software cannot just provide. Like it's just physically impossible. So we have like...
Do you feel like having Figma come before helps in like selling that aspect of like, hey, look, these guys have done it before.
Yeah. I mean, I think Figma did a lot of things right. Dylan Fields, Figma CEO, is one of our angel investors. So I think they did a lot of things right. I think they sort of like, fear is the mind killer, from the Dune series. It's really true. Like, people think like web couldn't do a lot of things. I think Figma sort of removed that idea that like anything can be done on the web if you work hard enough. And I think that really kind of like, now people don't think web cannot do anything anymore because of Figma, because I think they just sort of like remove the barrier. And I think there's definitely like that definitely helped us.
When we had a pre-interview, like you told me, like, I don't know, I wrote down at least like anything that can be built on the web ultimately will. And I feel like that's a philosophy that it seems like you're working with.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's this like Zavinsky's law or something. It's like, like all editors will eventually evolve to have like an email client built in. And I think someone was like, like everything that can be done in rewritten in JavaScript will be eventually written in JavaScript. And I think we kind of like arrive at that conclusion in a sideways fashion because of, like ASM came along and then like, oh, you don't have to write, you don't have to write JavaScript anymore. You can like write C++. And then like someone will turn that into like WebAssembly and it'll work. So you don't have to even like write JavaScript, but you have this VM now. It's like a browser that will kind of like run whatever you throw at it. So it's definitely powerful.
I want to dive a little bit more into on the technical side. When we talked to you, you mentioned that there was actually a lot of things that needed. You said there was like a lot of stars that need to align for Felt to be able to start working, and you had talked to me about OpenStreetMap being one of those, a lot of the browser tech being able to support what you guys are doing. And so I'd kind of like be a little bit curious if you could expand on what it took to be able to build something like Figma. Well, there we go. Tells you what I'm thinking about. Felt, sorry. It's same letter, man. It's like hard to...
Short. We have a shorter URL.
Yeah, that's another question I have.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I mean, I think a lot of stars have to be aligned, both on the technical side, organizational side, the world side. One is that I think data was initially like, when people talk about like maps, I think people sort of, a lot of people immediately think of like Google Maps, Apple Maps or something, which are really like routing tools plus POI, like point of interest databases for most people use. But like maps is...
What do you mean? Like, I'm actually not sure I follow on that. Could you expand?
For example, like when people talk about like, oh, like we're building a mapping tool, this is like Google Maps. If you look at how most people use Google Maps, it's to like find directions. It's like, oh, how do I go from X to Y? Plus, they kind of like search in, Chinese restaurant near me. And then, like they show up. Like that's what Google Maps is to a lot of people. There's tiles, there's like pretty images, like you look at, you look at a map, it's like, oh, okay, this is, this street, this is that street. But like I'm sure someone reading from Google Maps will like yell at me for this. I think you could like remove tiles from Google Maps and like most people will be like, this is annoying, but like it will work. Like as long as it gives you good directions, as long as it shows you the best Chinese food around you, like you could probably omit the map view for like a certain chunk of like use cases and it'll be fine. It's an interesting UI experiment,
It's like an MVP thought process, yeah.
Yeah, someone should make a mapped Google Maps without any map view. And I don't know, like someone will make it and it will actually work. I don't know, it would be good, but it will be useful.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, anyway, going back to your question about stars being aligned. So this data is super expensive and like super hard to find. And so like OpenStreetMap sort of like became sort of like good enough in the sense that like, if not better, and I think a lot of like the Western world especially, OpenStreetMap sort of became like, oh, like the data in OpenStreetMap is really good now. So So that was like thing number one. Okay, you don't have to like use this like super expensive tiles to like render a map. Like when I say tiles, think about data, like the street data, administrative boundaries, all the kind of stuff. So that's like thing number one. Thing number two is browsers got good that you could actually like do this kind of stuff like wildly. I mean, they've been getting better like the last few years, but I tell, it's like Figma is an interesting thing. Like you could probably not start building, you could not have Figma in 2010. You could start building Figma in 2010, which is I think around the time when they started. But it took them like a couple of years to build their like render. And then right around that time, browsers got good enough, and like the GL-based browsers got in like market share. You could just like do it. So the technology got good enough on the browser side. Technology also got good enough on the server side. Like when Sam and I built the first prototype of Felt, it was kind of like, is that it? Like, we have like Docker, so you don't have to sort of like, if you want to use like server-side tools, previously you had to like go ahead and like set up like 20 different things. Now you kind of go into like, you have a Docker file that kind of like encapsulates the service that you're trying to run. You throw it over to like render, or I don't know. I mean, we're using still render. You throw it over to render, it just sort of like works. So, okay, like we had this like tile server that just like runs and it's really like 4 lines of code. Because like Docker file down some other Docker file, some magic incantation happens. So that's the other part of it. And I think there was this sort of like, I believe in this philosophy that, we're like we have a lot of agency, obviously. Like, this team is unique. We are building something unique, but at the same time, it's like if all the stars are aligned and if there's this like demand for it, like someone will do it. So it's like, why not us?
So let me make sure I understand. You're saying there's the technical aspect, which is the browser starts being able to do everything you need it to do. On the compute server side, it's also able, like, it's a lot easier to deploy things. And then you can have a base layer with OSM that's like really good, that's a lot cheaper than what you could do. So basically all of these things come together, meaning that the initial investment in like time, compute, money, all these things is a lot lower to get started.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't want to like give away like too much over like secret sauce, but like, I don't think you could like build like, when I started my technical career, 2010, like if you needed like a new service, you like commissions physical machines, and then you talk to like someone, and then you have this like, okay, like which Linux distribution it's running, okay, like what is it gonna install, like that's gone, right? Like AWS EC2 being streamed to the cloud, but then you still have to like find like an EC2 machine and like find like an AMI image. Like that is also gone. Now we just like find like a Docker file. Like even that is kind of going away. Like now, like, you kind of go into this like per request pricing, aka, Lambda, serverless. Like serverless is just like per request pricing, right? So like everything is becoming like higher and higher level abstraction. So like a small team, like you don't need physical blink and light managing people. You just like press a button and then like, I don't know, there's a service that responds to HTTP requests now, and then like you can start building.
Yeah, I like the blinking lights.
Yeah.
It's someone else. You pay for it differently, though.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely someone else, yeah.
Where does the name come from?
Where does the name come from? I honestly, like, I'm 100% honest, like, I forget the origin story, but I think I remember our sort of criteria was that we wanted it to be human. Like, we wanted it to be approachable. We didn't want to call it GeoShape Mapping Kit Tool Box HQ. You wanted it to be sort of...
The SEO on that's probably better, though.
Yeah, you'd be surprised. I think we wanted to be sort of like human. I think there was sort of like... We had this like list of names that we wanted to like explore. I think the reason like Felt, the origin of Felt was... we were thinking about like felt tip, like painting, like felt tip pens and stuff. So I think there was sort of this like, okay, like painting, brush, like, so we made this like a list of names, and then we like kind of like looked at like what domain names were available for all of those. Felt.com was not available, but it was for sale. So it kind of like fit into like a lot of our criteria. You know, it was like short. It was sort of like cute. You know, felt the pad is sort of like evokes this like artistic sensibility. So yeah, that's like where it came from.
That domain name must not have been cheap.
I mean, you know, that's in the eye of the beholder. It was not
fair enough.
It was not millions. It was like tens of thousands. I think we got a good deal, to be honest. And I think part of the reason was it was sort of like available without like a lot of human interaction. Because like, I don't know if you ever like dealt with like domain purchases. Sam's previous company was called Remix, and it's hosted at remix.com. They should send you like, they should tell you like that he's done this before. And like, that's like a very time consuming process to buy domains from, you know, domain squatters / domain brokers. So Felt was also like available like automatically. You just like paid the money and that became yours. So that was also like another reason.
And that like, do you feel like that? I don't know. I find these stories of like domain names actually weirdly interesting. Like, do you feel like that played in the name? Like in the choice of the name, like the fact that it was easier to get.
Yeah,
like,
yeah. I mean, 100%. Like if Felt was beyond, I mean, you know, like we also like bought this domain like 2.5 years ago at this point. Like we had just raised seed money, right? So like we didn't have time and money to like deal with this like huge things. Like Sam's previous company was called Remix for a bit. But then they were like a tiny company, so they became like Transit Mix, and then like they kind of like renamed to Remix when they got like money later on. So like I think Remix, Transit Mix, Remix is the origin. You might be mad that I'm like telling you this, but sorry. So yeah, the fact that it was available and like easy to purchase was definitely a reason why the company's name Felt.
Then like first of all, this is pretty funny.
Yeah.
How like who are the people that you try to get to, like who's the target audience that you're trying to serve, and then how do you find those people? How do you get those people to start using it? Because I'm like, the reason I'm asking is I'm guessing it's not your average map nerd who spends, you know, who knows already even what a GeoJSON is. I feel like if people know what a GeoJSON is, it's like already like such a small subset of people. My mom doesn't know what a GeoJSON is. Well, to be fair, she does know what a JSON is, but most people probably don't know what a JSON is, but they could still benefit from what you guys are building. So I'm curious, like, how are you thinking about that?
I mean, like our target market is sort of like the very just diverse range of customers, right? People call this like product-led growth. So we have like a product-led growth motion. So there's a freemium tier for anyone to try and then start using it. You know, you can sign up for free, create an account. They will guide you through a tutorial about like, you know, squirrel maps in New York City Central Park. And then
is
you can
that
like
a real one you've actually seen?
What do you mean?
The squirrel map in New York, like. This is an oddly specific example.
No. It is our tutorial. If you sign up the Felt today, it will guide you through a scroll map of New York City. So it is like every single person that signed up the Felt to run through this. So yeah, we kind of like have this enterprising tier. So we expect people, these like enterprising people in these like, you know, geospatial or geospatial adjacent companies to like start like playing around with it and see how it feels. Obviously, in our early days, there was like both through our Sam, our Rachel, our like chief of staff and head of customers, that they kind of like knew a lot of people in the urban planning industry. So those people were like, "What are you guys working on?" So that started from there. We started sort of like contributing a lot to, you know, we hired like Erica Fisher, who has worked on like Tippecanoe, which is sort of like the tiling service that sort of powers a lot of the maps still today. So it started like, okay, like the technical people who are building JSON tools start hearing about Felt because we're like working on this kind of stuff. And then we start building more marketing awareness, you know, like this, you know, obviously I'm not on this podcast, so like just, you know, shill Felt, but like, you know, this is the kind of things that, you know, people start hearing about Felt. We go to like conferences. We were at like NACTO, we were like NACES, this cartography conferences. So people start like hearing about like felt over and over. I think the key is we have this like free tier that allows people to just like give it a try, and our hope is that it's sort of like slowly like seeps into like an organization, and you find yourself like, oh my god, I cannot live without felts. Like my workflow has just like gone like just like cumbersome to fun, and now you're like, okay, like I'll pay. So that's the ideal. Like like all the incentives are aligned. People like utilizing the tool. So yeah, in terms of like industry, like I don't know, the guy used to joke, not like joke, it's real. Like if you have a physical presence on Earth as a business, there's probably someone in your company looking at a map, like if you, like a retail chain, or if you are, I don't know, like urban planners, obviously like an example, like consultants, it's like, they do like site scope analysis, like educators. It's like, okay, like what's the history of like expansion of like Ottoman Empire to like, okay, like where does your like sugarcane come from? Like these are all much better on maps. These like, stories are told better on maps. It's easy to collaborate on maps. There's like, I think like maps are just sort of like this medium that is just like people are just like almost like wired to be attracted to. So if you just like make it easier to build and make it easier to collaborate, I think we're going to become sort of like a common toolkit. Like I think the way I sort of like think about it is that like you start any company today, like a medium size, whatever. Like I think every company is a tech company now because everyone uses tech products. You start a company, whatever industry you're in, you start using like certain like suite of tools. You get like a calendar app, Office 365, Google Calendar, Zoho, whatever. You got an email, same. You got maybe like a Slack or something like that, so communication thing. But there is probably room for like, and then you become like specializing it a bit. Like certain companies get like Canva, Figma, certain company gets like Notion. And I think there's like a lot of companies that are like, oh yeah, you need also like this mapping tool to like go with it. And then previously that didn't exist, so you didn't get it before, but now it exists, so now you should get it. I think that's like one way of looking at it, how we approach customers. Another way to look at it is that like people who actually work with geospatial data, there's like millions of them. And then their tools are pretty, I think their tools could use an upheaval.
I like that long pause.
Yeah.
I think that means everything.
Yeah. I think there's like people don't know the pain they're like used to. That's what I'm trying to say. People don't know that like there's a better way to do this.
Are there like specific examples where, I don't know, you thought were particularly fun or like were delighted for or surprised by?
Yeah, I mean like multiple. There's this land trust in New York, Westchester's land trust map. They embedded like a felt map that's showing this like intricate map of like protected land in New York State without any extensive, like GIS background, right? They just they had this like data sets. They like dropped it into felts. It just worked. They're like, cool. Like what? And then like felt already supports like embedding. And now it's like embedded in their website. There's this company that works in like Scandinavia, and there's a guy called like Diego Canales. He used like felt to sort of like visualize the speed limits in all across Scandinavia, and then he was talking about how it's like their data set is like 4 gigs originally, and then he was just like, okay, like how do I work with this like data? But then like you drop it into felts, it just works. Alta Planning. There's like a consulting company, they work a lot with other clients. And then like for them, when they use something like felts, like it helps their business, right? Because, the clients bring in data in all sorts of formats, around like, transit planning, about like, city planning, or like, site suitability analysis. And then like when Alta is like, oh yeah, like we have this tool that we internally use felts. And then like they're doing like a client presentation, and then they can like just drop that file in. It just works. I think it makes Alta planning look wildly more professional. And then, that's more for us. So I'll send you these links after the call.
Yeah, that sounds great. We can put those in the show notes for people who want to
I
take a
always
look
wanted
at
to
it
say show notes. This is my first time saying show notes, because I listen to a lot of podcasts, and it's always like, you can find the links in show notes. I'm excited to be a part of your show notes.
Well, there we go. Our description as well, if you want. That's more YouTube lingo.
Yeah.
Do you want to do that one as well?
Sure. Yeah, of course. We should do it. We should do it on YouTube. And I'm also excited for people to find our podcasts wherever they get the podcasts.
But I like this. Okay, it's all about like making it easier for people to just try it for themselves, and then it just works for their applications.
Yes. Plus, especially for example, like in Alta's case, it is also like allows Alta team to collaborate with internally and with also their clients, right? Like previously what they used to do was much more cumbersome. Now it's just like, it's sort of like the tool sort of fades away, because all you do is like just collaborate on like a link. And I think we kind of like take it for granted. Like that's, how it goes back to what we were talking about earlier. It's like, there's a lot of like magic, when you collaborate in Figma. I mean, it's not magic, it just works. There's no magic, it's just software. But it's cool. Like, I like it. Like, I find it just like personally very satisfying to see people like use this tool that didn't exist before. It exists now. They don't even think about it. That's cool.
I like seeing, like, it seems like you have a lot of optimism and excitement about like when you're talking about this, which to me feels very weird for a guy who described himself as cynical. Like,
yeah. I mean, I think this. I mean, I also approach my cynicism with a hint of cynicism, in the sense that I think I try to like overcorrect sometimes. It's like, I think, some people think like cynicism is like expecting like the worst of people. Like, it's not that. I think like worst can happen. But at the same time, I learned that like, if you kind of like don't focus on the worst that can happen, the good happens more than not.
I feel like you have to have that. Like, when also we had this pre-interview, you also told me about like the importance of having a vision and like knowing where you want to go and things like that. Like, it seems like there's a lot of a hope about the future, rather than thinking, oh my God, like the worst could happen.
Yeah, I mean, the worst could happen. Like, what am I going to do? Like, but I think it's just like, I think the thing that gives me hope and energy more than anything else is like seeing these customers use the product, right? But you kind of like see people actually like tell us, is like, oh my God, this is amazing. It's just like, it's time, like that makes your day. And I'm like, okay, like you take that energy and like work on more stuff. And, like we're an engineering company. We're almost all, most of our people are engineers. So you kind of like run into this, like every once in a while, it's like, oh my God, like I'm like dealing with this like GitHub issue. Like, is it dash? Is it like at like, is it like slash? Is it comma? Like, why is comma like working in every browser except it's not in the RFC? It becomes this like thing, and I'm like, why am I working on this? Like, what is going on? And then like, but then you get an email from someone being like, oh my God, like Felt just works. Oh, okay, like you take that energy and then gives you a high, and now you work at it for a couple more weeks.
I want to move on to a thing I actually didn't expect to see. Is recently you guys announced a partnership with QGIS.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know exactly like I don't remember exactly the details, but I was very surprised actually when I saw this, because it seems like those are pretty separate things that are actually trying to do the same thing. I would have imagined it would be more on the competing side, if you could say that, or like competing products in a way. QGIS is this free and open source software. I was still quite surprised. So could you talk a little bit about like what was the nature of that partnership and what was the rationale behind it?
The big thing sort of I think like Felt brings to mapping, one of the big things is it's like a web-based platform, right? Like we built for teams from ground up. there's a lot of like collaboration that sort of like comes easy when you're like web-based. You just go to a URL, everyone is on the same thing. There's no versioning. Like there's versioning, but it's always the URL is always like latest version, all this kind of stuff. So I think that sort of makes it a good companion to a lot of like desktop JS tools. We became the flagship sponsor of QGIS. That's the nature of the thing. So because like QGIS users are felt users, we have been interviewing a lot of our users, and then they're like, oh yeah, I use QGIS and felt. It's like I make this first thing in QGIS, and then I export it, I load it into felt. And I was like, oh, like there's a lot of like I make this thing in QGIS, but like felt makes it easy to share. Kind of wish that like felt and QGIS like worked together. So they need a place to share and like communicate their maps with their coworkers, with their like stakeholders, with their teammates. So I don't think it's competitive. I think it's like complementary. I think there are certain things that QGIS does that felt currently doesn't. And I think why not combine our forces? So do your work in QGIS. And I think there's always this like, if you look at like, and I think that's actually more common than people like think. Like, for example, if you look at, I didn't work in like banking or like other stuff, but like if you look at like how a lot of people work, like certain things happen in like other tools, and then you load it into Excel to kind of like share with other people, because Excel is sort of this like, like normalization format, like you use like statistical analysis, and then like, you use like SPSS or R, whatever. And then like, then you load it into Excel, and then you share with other people. And I think that has like moved up, and like now people Excel online or 365 or, Google Sheets, whatever. So like this suite of tools is actually very common. Like all industries, like no one does work in one tool and like share it out there, right? On the FigJam side, like Figma side, there's like Zeppelins, all those kind of things, like handout tools, like handover tools, all this kind of stuff. So it's like pretty common for this to happen. So I think like felt is like, okay, QGIS users are felt users because we talk to them all the time. QGIS is super powerful, and there are certain things that QGIS is probably the right thing to use, not felt. But the moment you want to like collaborate with other folks, load it into felt, get your teammate, get your get your coworkers, all those folks on the same page, and then go back to your work.
Yeah, I think it's really cool to see as well, like those projects get supported.
Yeah. I mean, I think we want to make sure that we want to support like a healthy ecosystem. We're like standing on the shoulders of giants, right? Like a lot of the tools that we use are open source or like, built by other folks. So we maintain Tippecanoe now, which is sort of like the de facto like vector tiling platform. So we worked with a lot with like protomaps built by Brandon Liu. We used to use protomaps like renderer, but we still use parts of like, the protomap suite of tools that Brandon and his team has built. We sponsored that. And we sponsor like QGIS because I think QGIS is a wildly powerful tool and it should exist. And we've been sort of enjoying a partnership with them.
That makes me happy to hear. That's great news. Yeah. I want to like shift gears a little bit. Like one of the things I noticed as well when I was looking you up, as one does when they prepare a podcast, is you write quite a lot. And you've written like about a lot of things. And I just like to poke your brain a little bit about what writing, why do you write? Basically, that's the question.
I don't know. I wish I could tell you why I write, but I think there's this.
What do you get out of it, rather, maybe?
I think it's fun. It's just, I think I sort of.
I'm seeing a trend here.
Well, part of it is like, baby. This is like a therapy session. I think part of it is, there's like multiple things. One is that it is just like fun for me. I think I certainly, like I'm not a native speaker of English. And I think sort of like English is for me a bit sort of this like a game that I play in my head. Like I always like like how, like what is a more interesting way to say this that appears like you get the meaning to the others, like you convey the meaning, but like is unexpected. And I think I like enjoy like wordplay aspect and everything that I do. So like the part of it is like that, like no doubt. Part of it is like I think, and I go back and forth on this, like the more you write, the more your opinions get sharpened. And that is a bit of like a dangerous thing. Like sometimes like you sharpen opinion you didn't think you had just because you like write it down. So like you have to be kind of careful, like to kind of, I think it happens a lot on Twitter. People sort of like, sharpen themselves into like a weirdo place. And then I think the other thing that sort of was like fascinating to me is like how hungry people are for like good writing. Not that I'm a good writer, but like how hungry people for like writing on things that like other people, I think a lot of people are surprised. Oh yeah, like I thought the same. And I never thought anyone would say that. It's like one class of feedback that you get that is like invigorating. The other class of feedback is like, well, like this is an interesting way to look at it. And I totally disagree, but I never thought that way. And there's also like, bad feedback. And like, that's like a kind of like function of size. But mostly it's like for me to kind of like exercise something in my brain that's like, that I don't exercise day to day. And I think the second big thing is sort of like building a bit of like our community. Like it is just kind of like fun to kind of like hang out with people who think the same way, or like kind of like don't think the same way, but kind of like get it. So I've been like, we found multiple of our engineers. We found one of our investors probably through my writing. And then they were like, oh yeah, like I read your blog post, and it's like, what are you guys working on? So it's like surprising how much there's activity in there. Like the feedback was very fascinating, very satisfying.
Right. And was that more like, because you're also very active on Twitter.
Yes. Yeah.
That's a bit of a different...
Twitter's definitely like, well, like I feel like I'm more unhinged on Twitter than like at work, which is kind of funny because Twitter's also like, my Twitter is pretty public, but it's like where I sort of like blurt out the random thoughts.
It does feel like brain dumping. Yeah, I was going through some of your Twitter a little bit before, and it feels like tapping into a stream of consciousness, which is I find very valuable. But I'm curious, like what's the value you get out of it?
I mean, I think most of it is just sort of like fun. I think like like most of my tweets, like when I used to commute, most of my tweets were like during commuting. Now most of my tweets are like waiting in line at coffee shops and stuff, or like waiting for like this test to pass, or like waiting, like I have like 20 minutes between meetings. So I see something funny, or like kind of like rant a bit. Most of the value I get is like I get it out of my head so I can move on. And if there's an occasional like, there's an occasional comments, and then like it becomes like a banter. I mean, that being aside, I think Twitter probably was one of our like most like highest like most productive ways to hire good talent. So that has been like wildly like we have multiple people that came through my Twitter, or like Felt's tweets and blog posts. People are like, oh yeah, like I want to like see what you guys are doing. You guys seem like real people. So that's the challenge. Like, like personally, I don't want to be kind of like, I don't want my Twitter to just be about like Felts and just be about like making sure that we get good talent out of it. So
yeah. It's a fine
line. But if you have a personality there, like people like react to it.
I like what you said about language as well. Like you mentioned that it was playing with words. And so do you speak Turkish, I take it, and then English is a second language?
Yeah. Yes. Yep.
Do you speak any other languages?
I think I can survive in German.
Okay.
And maybe French.
How different is Turkish from English?
Oh, very different. It's like Turkish is, it's like a Turkic language, right? Like it's like there's not a lot of common thread that goes back to, like, it's not like a Romance language, the Turkic language. It's like alliterative or something. What is it called? It's like you make conjugation by adding suffixes at the end of verbs. It's like, so you have a verb, you add a suffix, that becomes like current tense. You add another suffix that becomes like current tense first person. You add another suffix that becomes current tense first person, like ability modality isn't like can. So it's very suffix based. It's very different. There's not a lot of shared vocabulary. It's like subject, object, verb. So verb is always at the end. Like you almost always drop the subject. So it's like widely different. So German and English are obviously like same-ish.
Do you like, because I also speak 2 languages, and I this is like a weirdly tangent that I usually have about languages. I find it like really interesting how people think differently in different languages. Do you feel that are they things you think differently about in different languages?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I lived in the States since 2010. So approaching. Wait, no, Jesus. I lived in the States in 2006. I lived in San Francisco since 2010. So I think at this point, like I think in English day to day. One thing that is kind of funny is like I think like numbers sometimes is still like I like fall back to Turkish. It's kind of funny, like especially like it becomes like apparent. Like I don't use like numbers day to day, but for example, like I'm at the gym, right? Like and you're like counting like reps. It's like 1, 2. It's like something like breaks towards the end of a set, and you're like fall back to like 7, 6. Like you've not what happens? It's like so like numbers. I think like one area. Sometimes I fall back to Turkish, like involuntarily.
What brought you to the US?
College. So I just came to US for college in 2006. So that's why I didn't meet Sam, my co-founder, in college, but we went to the same college and we met through mutual, we were like at the same college for like, I think 4 years, but he was 1 year above me, but we had a mutual friend. So we met in the Bay in 2010 through our college friends. So I came to the US for college.
Right. And then you just stayed.
Yeah. Well, stayed-ish.
What does that mean?
So I left actually I didn't. So I came to US in 2006, went to college for 4 years in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania on the East Coast. And then in 2010, I moved to the Bay Area, started working at Dig 2010. And then 2017, I moved to New York, and then I sort of like needed a bit of like change of scenery. Plus, I think I like kind of like other things in mind. So like I actually decided to go to grad school for business. So I moved to Singapore, and then I was in France, and then came back. So there was like a 1.5 year gap where I might stay in the Bay Area.
That actually makes me think, like, does Felt work in different languages, or is that like actually on the roadmap or something?
It is on the roadmap, but it's primarily English right now. It's fully English. But if you upload data, for example, there's like something that's like probably like kind of like too hidden. Like a lot of our upload anything tooling is like probably deserves a bit more like marketing, and then we're working on it. So we have this, for example, we have this feature called like geo matching. And it actually is sort of like OpenAI based, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. We actually use OpenAI in production, but we don't talk about it too much. So,
you just did on a podcast, but that's okay.
Well, I mean, it's like, I feel like, I mean, you know, like we don't have this, we don't have to like, everyone has that, you know, the sparkly UI, you know, like magic, like people call it AI, magic and sparkly image. I just
so you don't emphasize this is what you mean.
We don't even like, I don't think there's any documentation about it anywhere, but
because it's a tool, right?
It is a tool. Yeah. Like it should be transparent to users, but the way the international stuff works is, so for example, you upload this like data set, and then we have this feature called like geo matching, where we can kind of like understand if a certain column is geospatial, contains geospatial data, right? If a column, like, you know, imagine like a Excel or CSV, there's latitude, longitude. So we used to have this sort of like heuristics and smarts around like, oh, like this column says lat or lat dot, or like maybe this column is like lat dot slash learned that like it's kind of like a lot of ways to like figure out this column of geospatial data. So we started like, we gave it a try with OpenAI. We like essentially send it like the header and like the first 5-6 rows. Like, is there any geospatial data? And if so, like what kind? And it sort of like does work like in a, like what? Like, and then it works in all languages, right? Like, you know, if the column, yeah, like, and then like this surprised us also, you know, like we tried with some like Turkish data, like it says, you know, altitudes, you know, longitudes, like address, street address, like the headers were like, you know, enlem, boylam, address, şehir. And then like it filled it correctly. Like not only it identified, it also was like, oh, şehir means city in Turkish. It's like, okay, this is a city column. I'm like, we didn't even ask you, but it did it. So that's like one way we have like international support kind of like hidden. And then we have a lot of users. Like there's just like a big chunk of users. I think like especially in like Europe, there's a kind of like culture of like open data, and like people are like very happy to sort of like give these tools a try. So we have a lot of people using it.
I think this is actually a nice place to start rounding it off. And so just like I like asking the same question when I start, I have the same one when I end. I like asking people for a book and actually a podcast recommendation. There's a couple of reasons for that, mostly because I think it's quite interesting. It's like a different way of poking at people's brains. And a lot of these go through word of mouth recommendation more than like algorithm or things like that. So not necessarily anything that we talked about, but we had a Dune reference earlier, for example. But just like any book that you think is worth recommending, and a podcast if you listen to any.
Yeah, I listen to a lot of podcasts, so I need to like, I mean, I know the one that I'm recommending, but should I like do a interesting one? Well, the book recommendation, there's this book that I probably recommended to like hundreds of people, but I'll recommend it here too. There's a book called Notes on a Foreign Country by Susie Hansen. I'll send you the link afterwards if you want. It's written by this woman who, she's American. It's like white American person. She ends up going to Turkey to follow the footsteps of, I think, James Baldwin. This like American writer who had, it's like black American writer, gay, who ends up like going to Turkey in like 60s, and is like, it's better to be like a black man in Turkey than in like America at the time. So she wants to follow his footsteps while the people that he interacted with are still alive, talk to them, kind of like documents what this guy was doing. But the book is really about like, where does America stand in the world? Like the interesting things about the book is like, what happens in America affects people outside the world, and then people don't have a say in it. It's a very like, once you get into that, like, and then like Turkey is a special country in a lot of ways. It's kind of like this a country that is sort of like, are we pro-West? Are we pro-East? You know, and obviously it's ongoing right now with the elections. So like Turkey aggressively like became like an American ally in like 80s. But like, I think that was like a bit like top down versus like bottoms up. So like that never sort of like clicked with the people in a way that I think like the authority wanted it to click. Or it's even unclear if authority even wanted to click. Was it like a more like America be like, you're with us now, okay? So, okay. So that this book is like partly about that, and partly about like how like America's like original sin is like racism, and it's like how like because America like never came to terms with like racism, it is just like this like aggressive country. It's like, you know, like people don't think of like, you know, like think of like Sweden. You don't think about like, you know, like you think about IKEA and, you know, like, you know, like Volvo and like meatballs and I don't know, like shitty pop music that I love. But like, you know, you think of America, you're like, oh, guns and fire, you know, F-16s bombing people. So yeah, I think she has a very good way of like tying back a lot of Americas. So that's the book. In terms of the podcast, my like favorite podcast by far is Capitalisms, which is this like podcast hosted by Luigi Zingales and Bethany McLean. I've been listening to it for like years. I think they had like other hosts, Katie Waldock. the sort of like the podcast's theme is like, is capitalism good actually? And it is like this, like, you know, both hosts are like fervent capitalists in some sense, but they're like, why is like things not working the way it should be working, like capitalism suggests it should? They have like a very good way of sort of like is what is happening, I don't know, in like the tech industry, the ad tech, or like interest rates, like why is things not going the way capitalism said it should be? Is it like, what is happening? Like, what are just forces that are like, so that's probably like my most like podcast that I find a lot of value in.
That sounds great. Like,
cool.
I never heard about either of those, which is what I prefer when I've never heard about it.
Yeah. I mean, if you want to go, I probably should have mentioned this. I discovered this podcast like a couple months ago, and I like cannot stop listening to it, but it's like pretty like, maybe cut this out. But there's a podcast like My Dad Wrote a Porno.
Oh yeah, I've heard about that. Yeah.
Okay.
I haven't listened to it, but I've heard about it.
Someone like suggested to me, and I'm like, I'm not gonna like put that on my phone. They're like, no, like you have to. Adam's like, what the hell? It's like hilarious because it becomes a universe. That's like,
right. Yeah.
So
cool.
Come on.
Well, John, this was a really fun conversation. Thanks for taking some time to talk with me and tell me about Felt. We'll put everything in the show notes.
Okay, I'll send you the links, and I'm excited for you listeners to get this podcast wherever they get the podcast. Oh, what is it? Like, rates us wherever they get their podcasts.
Yeah, great. I should hire you as my marketing guy.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Maxime.